to you from the book of Luke, and we're going to parachute in for a few minutes tonight to this amazing encounter between Jesus and a guy called Zacchaeus. It's a funny story. It's one that would be better known, I suppose, to a lot of us from our Sunday school days, if you were a Sunday school person, or you knew people that were, because it's a funny story that is easy to make kids laugh and play act out a short guy climbing a tall tree to see Jesus. But something massive is going on here. In fact, it's so massive what's going on here, it probably cost me half of our church. Half of our church left in about 2 years, in the late 90s, when I began to understand what was actually going on in our church and many around this country. And you all know this, I hope. And if you don't know this, you need to know this. 98% of our country are not in church and are quite anti-church. So we have a massive, massive work cut out for us. Do you know why most people are not in church? Because they've been. I think in fairness to them, it's not their fault, it's our fault. We have not built churches that spoke their language. We've not built churches where people feel they're beloved and be welcomed, just like many of you didn't feel you'd be loved and welcomed here before you came here. And so I realized in the late 90s that our church had become comfortable because most of our church were white, middle-class people. White middle class could hardly be the description of Bradford no more than it would be of Liverpool. And so when a church's growth is really driven by the same people joining all the time, when the church's demographic is the same people only and mainly for years, what it's telling you is we have a massive problem here. It's telling you that the church's circle of love is driven by comfort, not by compassion. Because we do want to reach people, don't we, that we feel comfortable with. Of course, that's natural to want to hang out with people you get on with, you're comfortable with. I get that. The problem is when it becomes exclusive and cliquish. And that's what happened in our church 20-odd years in. And I was very concerned about that. And white middle-class people need Christ like anyone else, but they're not the only people in town, certainly not in our town. If you took a photograph of our congregation, went into Bradford and showed people in our city a photograph of the congregation and said to them, which city in this country do you think those people meet as a church? They would not have said Bradford. They would have probably said the stockbroker belt of London somewhere. That's how non-representative we were of our city. So we had, the church was in the city, but the city was not in the church. Except in our preaching, in our theology. We would sing songs every Sunday. The lyrics would be on screen. And if you were to measure us and describe us by the lyrics of our songs and the language of our preaching, you would think we were reaching the world. But what I said a moment ago was our problem. Every Sunday we were taking a flight in a flight simulator. We were singing songs, but it was virtual reality. Because the moment you came into our church and you were different to the people that were there, if looks could kill, you'd never come back. And so I realized we had a massive problem. And the problem was this: our church was a good church, not a bad church. These weren't bad people that were resistant to reaching out, I suppose. In our theology, we wept for the lost and we prayed for the lost and shabba-dabba-dood over them. And did all of that for 20 years. These were good people that loved God, filled with the Spirit, great families, great relationships. We had great preaching, great worship in the church. Everything was great, and that was the problem. It's hard to tell someone they're sick when they feel well. It's hard to say to a church we're dying when we're having a great time, which proved the point to me, not every box you die in is shaped like a coffin. Sometimes the shape of what we die in is shaped like a Christmas present with a ribbon on it because we're having a great time. With no awareness that whilst we're having a great time, we're slowly dying because we are slowly becoming less and less relevant to people who don't go to church. So the 99 that's gathered in have a religious club experience every week, and we forget where we came from. And this message tonight is to remind you to not do that, because this church is not only or even mainly for you. This church is for the ones that are still missing, which was once you and was once me. So here's Jesus' amazing high profile. And by the way, these encounters with Jesus and people like Zacchaeus, in my opinion, were staged. John said in his gospel, he said that if all the things Jesus did were written down, there wouldn't be enough books in the world to contain what he did. In other words, there's more that he did that we don't know about than what we do know about because of duplication. And so we don't want to know everything he did, because everything he did will be multiple duplications of the things we do know he did. So there's enough of one type of every person that Jesus staged an encounter with for us to learn something massive from. And Zacchaeus, I think, is one of those. And it says that Jesus was passing through Jericho, Luke 19, 1-9. And a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot and looked up, he said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He is gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to Jesus, "Look, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. If I've cheated anybody out of anything," and he had, "I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today's salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost." He is a guy that was a high-profile, despised person in the community, which may have once been you, or it may be someone that is on your mind tonight as I begin to speak that you wish was here, and that you are putting all your eggs in the basket of that person coming to a Christmas event here. By the way, Christmas is a time, it is the only time in this heathen country where going to church is not weird for unchurched people. So you should cash in on it. If you go to church any other time of year and people say, "Where are you going?" and you said church, they'll be like, "Are you freaking kidding me? Is something wrong with you? Is it a funeral? Is it a wedding?" But Christmas, when unsaved people say, "I'm going to church," people are kind of okay with it. So they feel more comfortable to go. This is why Christmas time we should go crazy with inviting. And don't do RSVP inviting. Just invite like confetti. Don't invite like a divine appointment stuff. The divine appointment stuff has killed us. It's too specialist. It's too focused into one person. So cash in on this season of all the events you have as a church and invite people to come, because culturally it feels kind of a bit more comfortable than it will be after Christmas when it goes back into heathen world of our country. Zacchaeus is a high-profile, hated, despised person. And yet he's interested in Jesus. So he figures out what his itinerary is going to be, goes online and Googles Jesus' itinerary, finds out he's coming by his area a few days' time, goes ahead, scouts out a good hiding place, and figures out that this sycamore fig tree, and by the way, there are different kinds of fig trees apparently. The sycamore fig tree is the one with the greatest foliage, the biggest leaves. I think he liked that because his concealment would be better in a tree with big leaves on it. So he figured it out well. And he goes and hides in the tree and gets comfortable, and Jesus comes by with an entourage as usual. In the entourage was his own apostolic team, the disciples, and then he had the crowd that were coming wondering whether or not maybe they get a free meal today because they know he was reputed to have fed people with loaves and fishes, and people got free meals around Jesus. That was of interest to hungry people. Some wondered whether or not would be their day for getting a miracle. They were there too. Then he had those fake news people there that Donald Trump hates. And we should all hate, by the way. Those fake news people that traveled with Jesus just waiting for him to put a foot wrong, say something controversial, then they could post about it instantly with their spin on it and get it and damage his reputation. They were there too. And he stops at the foot of the tree, looks up, and calls this guy by his first name. We have no idea how Jesus knew he was there, let alone knew his name. Imagine if this was you, you'd figured out your hiding place, and you are there in secret, way ahead of the crowd arriving, and then the guy you came to see but not be seen to be looking at him knows you there and knows your name. He must have nearly fallen out the tree. When he looked up and said the name Zacchaeus, it was probably like looking up and saying Harvey Weinstein's name at the moment. That's how controversial and hated that name was at that time in that community. And this is what happened. He calls this guy's name. When he said the name, you could have heard a pin drop in the crowd, especially amongst the religious fake news people, that this guy Zacchaeus was there. What came next made it worse. Because Jesus said, I want you to come down from the tree, not to do this to you. I want you to come down from the tree because I want to come and hang out with you, spend time with you at your home today. And in front of all these people that hated him and hated Zacchaeus, he walks to this man's house, high profile, broad daylight. He could have, couldn't he, walked past the tree, said to one of his team, there's a guy in that tree. He's Zacchaeus. He's a tax collector. People hate him. We must love him. Go and tell him I'll meet him later. When it's got dark, I'll call by his house. Jesus could have arranged a secret meeting, would have been less painful for him. Because listen to me carefully. This is what I discovered to my cost, and you maybe can discover at lesser cost, but not at no cost. Every time you include someone that the world, and especially the church, excludes, you will suffer. And you need to be ready for this, especially in a city like Liverpool. You need to be ready that every time you include scallies, every time you include scoundrels, every time you include Zacchaeuses, and some of you were him, and some of you were the woman at the well, and some of you were the woman caught in adultery, and some of you were the thief on the cross, and some of you were, I could go on, some of you were those people, and there's thousands and thousands that are not far from this building who would not dream of coming here because they do not believe, no more than Zacchaeus did, that they will be welcomed. So Zacchaeus has to climb in a tree and try and look at Jesus from a distance. I suppose the tree could be a metaphor for the internet. The internet is where people can look at Jesus without being seen to be looking because they're not yet ready to come to church. Because if they come to church, you're going to know that Zacchaeus came, and if looks good kill, he won't be back. So from the safety of the internet or the tree, I suppose, you can hide and still look at a podcast from this church that goes out this week, or look at something online that you put out. You should encourage your friends and family, by the way, to do that, because seeing is believing in this country. Because when you mention the word church, nobody thinks of this. They think of all the things you don't want them to. So you have to show people a visual of this. So make sure that when you talk to people, give them a website, give them somewhere to go and look, give them a piece of music, because they don't think this. Because young people don't go to church. Churches don't meet in buildings like this. Churches don't have this kit. Churches don't do contemporary relevant music. Churches don't have kids on the drums. Churches don't have nice lighting. Churches don't have good communication skills. Churches don't have excellence and quality and hospitality. This is not what they think when you mention the C word. So you have to make sure that in all your communication with unchurched people, try and make sure they get a visual on what it is that you are doing here. This is why I put out thousands upon thousands of DVDs into our city just with visuals about our church. A Welcome to Our Church DVD. I printed thousands and thousands of them. This is before the internet, so that people could give it to their friends and say, when I talk about our church, that's what I mean. And when people would privately in their own homes play it, that resulted in so many people coming to our church, especially with their kids who saw it, because seeing is believing in this country. So, Jesus goes to this man's house, and the religious people start to freak out. And here's why they're freaking out. Because going to this man's house was a huge act of this. Going to this man's house wasn't just hospitality or having a coffee or having a meal together or popping into this man's house. In that culture, and many cultures around the world today still, breaking bread with someone, having a meal with someone is a huge act of this. And the religious people were freaking out because they didn't believe this man deserved this. And so Jesus is extending acceptance to this man, but this is what really upset people. This is what upset people with Jesus. It still upsets people with churches that still do this, and there aren't enough churches that do this, which is why this is important. But I say this to you all tonight at this stage of your journey, at this stage of your growth. You must never, ever forget what I'm going to talk to you about, what I'm telling you tonight, because our church forgot this. And we were 20 years in, and we were a good church and didn't see the problem because it was a massive blind spot for us, as it was for the early church. What upset people about Jesus, what will upset people about your church and what upset people about ours, and half of them left, is that before Jesus extended this to Zacchaeus, he didn't first ask him to do any of this. Because as far as God's concerned, and here's the title for this thought tonight, as far as God's concerned, acceptance always precedes change. Acceptance precedes change. Not as far as people are concerned, it doesn't, because what we have done with these two things is we have swapped them around. We have swapped these around, and we've said to people, you can have this, but you have to earn it with some of this. This happens in marriages, happens in friendships, happens in teams, it happens in bosses towards employees, it happens in leaders to followers and pastors to churches. We change these round, and we start to use this as a means for people in our relationships to behave in a way that makes us feel you have earned a little bit of this from me. And so now we start making this something that we think belongs to us. And so acceptance now does not precede change, which is what upset religious people. Jesus didn't ask Zacchaeus to do any of this. We know that Zacchaeus did begin to offer change because it says, we just read, he said to Jesus, didn't he? If I've robbed anybody, I'll pay them back 4 times. I want to change. I want to help the poor. I want to change. We have no idea that Jesus ever asked him to do any of that. All we know is that Jesus just did this to him. What that means is this: the way God gets people to change and the way we get people to change is not by doing this. This is what makes you not want to change. Just try it with your kids. What makes people want to change is that if you overwhelm them with this, they start to volunteer this. I think Zacchaeus felt so overwhelmed by Jesus' acceptance of him. At his own cost, Jesus suffered to include him. He suffered all the criticism, all the muttering, just like he did all the other people I named earlier, the thief on the cross. When the thief on the cross reached out to Jesus with his dying breath and said, remember me today, reached out to Jesus for eternity to be spent with Jesus, wanted to go to heaven with Jesus. When he reached out to Jesus, Jesus didn't say, well, you would reach to me now, wouldn't you? I'm not stupid, you know. You've got nothing else to lose. And now you're saying, remember me. You could have come to one of my meetings over the last few years. You knew me and I knew about you and your mate here. You were well-known, high-profile robbers. So don't be asking me now, remember me. Where were you when I was out here praying for the sick and preaching? You never came near. Jesus never lectured him. Jesus didn't say, well, if I'm going to do this to you, say sorry from the cross to the people you stole from. Because many of the people that you stole from that have come to see you die, who think you've got your own comeuppance, they're all here. So shout sorry to them, and then you can have this. He didn't say that. Jesus just said, you're in. Religious people don't like it. Because if you feel you earned this, and you didn't, by the way, but if you feel you earned this by being a goody two-shoes, by being a Christian and by being a tither and a worshiper and a volunteer and in a small group, or being holy, or whatever of this you feel you've done for God, you feel this kind of came to you the hard way. But the truth is that before any of you were born again, before any of you came to Christ, God sent his Son to die on the cross, which was a massive act of acceptance of humanity. So you didn't earn anything. This acceptance thing was settled as far as God's concerned before you were born. And by the way, the cross is not for the church. The cross was for humanity. The difference between before you're a Christian and after isn't acceptance. You were accepted through what God did through his Son on the cross. When Jesus shed his blood, he was saying, I accept all of humanity. And by the way, acceptance doesn't mean endorsement. This is what a lot of religious people struggle with. You think because we accept people, because Jesus accepts Zacchaeus, people assume Jesus is saying, I'm okay with your sin. And that's not what he's saying. Acceptance doesn't equal endorsement. Acceptance doesn't mean we approve of your wrongdoing. Jesus wasn't saying that, but he was willing to risk people thinking that because he didn't explain himself. When in the late 90s I started bussing in people from these council estates, I think our church would have stayed with me longer. Those that left would have stayed with it longer if I'd have said to them, I know you're concerned that I'm bussing in a lot of these people, that I'm messing up our white middle class party. But I promise you, I have asked them to change their behavior and improve their behavior. I've asked them to give up drugs and give up this and give up that. I think if every week I'd have got up and said to our church, listen to me, I know we don't like having these people here, but I've asked them and they're working on it. Maybe they'd have stayed with it a bit longer. But I knew it would be wrong for me to say that to the church because I knew God wasn't doing that with us. If you woke up this morning and didn't know whether or not God accepted you like he did the day before, until you changed a bit more today, you wouldn't know where you stood with God today. Some of you are like this with yourself. Some of you don't accept you. Some of you hate you. Some of you do not accept yourself because you feel you haven't earned that acceptance of you, and you don't love you, which means you struggle to love someone else, because Jesus said you got to love your neighbor, love humanity like you love you. And if you don't like you and don't love you, it's hard to give away what you don't have. But some of you don't accept you until you feel you've changed more to earn acceptance, even if you making peace with you. That's how out of whack this thing gets. This is a massive issue in the church all around the world. It was the major dividing issue for the early church. Because the early church would have been Jewish only if it had been up to the Apostle Peter. The Apostle Peter, the guy that walked on water and raised the dead and the sick were healed in his shadow, the Apostle Peter, you would want him to be your pastor. You'd certainly want him in your church. The Apostle Peter, he'd a man. Do you know something about Peter? He hated Gentiles, which is most of the planet. Most of the planet are not Jewish. If it had been down to Peter, the church would have only been Jewish. And even though he spent 24/7, 3 years with Jesus, he still had a massive issue towards non-Jews. I say that to say this, just because you're in a good church, and ours was a good church. We have great preaching and great worship and great relationships and a lot of love and all of that. Just because we have that in our churches doesn't mean that we are immune from this same blind spot where we also have issues and we also have barriers up and resistance to and a finger wagging at certain types of people we don't approve of. This was Peter. And the thing about it is, while he's raising the dead and healing the sick and driving out demons, while he's doing all of that, he's still being used by God. Never think just because God uses you that everything's okay. Which is what I think Peter could have thought. Well, hang on a minute. I'm walking on water. I'm raising the dead. So the fact that I don't like Gentiles, clearly God's not bothered about it. It was way after Pentecost. It was even way after the early church had begun when Peter's still battling this issue. If you remember, he's on a rooftop and a sheet came down 3 times with animals in it. And this voice said to him, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And he said, "I'm a good Jewish boy. I don't eat unclean, non-kosher food." And answers this question 3 times from his Jewishness, not knowing this was not about animals. The animals were a picture, a type of people, Gentiles, that he hated. No sooner had that thing happen 3 times, then a knock comes at the door from 3 of those unclean people that he had a problem with. And an angel had appeared way down the road in another part of the area to a guy called Cornelius, who is not only a Gentile, he's a Roman military leader. Amazing who angels appear to and who they don't. And the angel said to him, "We like you. Us lot in heaven, we like you. Because you love people, you look after people, you feed the hungry, you look after people. We like you. We in heaven like you. But we know there's a piece of the jigsaw that you don't have. A guy called Peter's got it. Here's the GPS coordinates to his house. Send your staff. Go get Peter. Tell him an angel appeared. Give us your address. Told you that you should come to my house. You have a message for us." God set it all up like a brilliant conductor of an orchestra. Peter comes to Cornelius' house. Hundreds possibly gathered in Cornelius' home. And Peter looks and took some colleagues with him. Peter said he took some colleagues with him for a bit of moral support. And Peter said, I now realize how true it is that God is no respecter of persons. What do you mean you now realize? What do you mean you now realize? 3 years, 24/7 with Jesus? How can you not have realized sooner is what we could say. And yet our church didn't realize either. And we were 20 years in. We didn't realize either that God was not white middle class. And we say, don't we, it's trendy now to say, a lot of contemporary churches have this in their branding, on their websites, in their preaching. We say, don't we, come as you are. Come as you are. What we often mean is come as we are. Because God help you if you come as you are. And our church was like that. And when people did come as they were, because I bust them in as they were, all hell broke loose in the church. And all hell broke loose in the early church. It resulted in what was called the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15, where they all had a big powwow together. The elders and the apostles met to talk about what do we do, because we are making it difficult for Gentiles to come to Christ, and we have to stop this because we are Judaizers, they were called. We're going into Gentile territory, and they were preaching, you can't be a Christian. They were preaching, you can't have this from God. Until you do more of this, you have to get circumcised. And you have to keep certain Jewish rituals. You have to do this. And when you've done all of those things we Jews tell you you must do, then you can have this. And so Judaizers were saying to these Gentiles, you're not really proper bona fide believers until you do some things that make you Jewish as well. And Paul said, I'm not having this. This is not the gospel. Let's stop making it difficult for people. And our church was making it difficult for people to come to Christ, who we prayed for and cried for. But it was okay while they were disinfected distance away. But when they started coming in by their hundreds, the reality of our heart was really shown for what it was, which was not love, but we were threatened by difference. We were narrow-minded. We were judgmental. And we shut them down as soon as they came in the door. And this became the massive dividing issue for us as it was in the early church. I remember a few years into our journey of what I'm teaching you about tonight, and you're a few years into your journey, one Sunday night I was speaking, and 3 transvestites came to the service. I think 3 transvestites is a bit overwhelming for a church. I think 1 is probably enough to do the trick in terms of upsetting us and getting the church mafia going. But 3 came. 3 came. And the elbows were flying, and the people were texting about the upset that these 3 transvestites were causing in the room that night. So I remember hearing it and the elbows flying and thinking, some guys came over here, they're over there, they're transvestites. And he told me more about us than he did about them. So I get up to speak, and I see these guys over there to my left. And when I finished speaking, I called them over to me. I wanted to talk to them here in front of everyone. So while the church was dismissing and the service was over, I wanted people to see me giving time to these people, because many of those people in the church felt they deserved my time more than these people. They felt they were more acceptable than these people, which is why Jesus staged high-profile encounters. I staged my own with these 3 transvestites that night and hundreds of others over those years. I said, hey, you guys, I called them over. And I said, great to see you guys tonight. Where are you from? So glad you came. And they said to me, one of them said, well, Pastor, we're not trying to cause trouble tonight. I said, I never said you were. They said, we come to this church often. We are homeless, and you feed us in your homeless program 2-3 times a week. Even your homeless team wouldn't recognize us, though, because we've never come dressed as women before. They've never seen us dressed as women, but we do. Well, I said, if you don't normally come dressed as women, then why did you come dressed as women tonight? They said, because today was the best dressed transvestite competition in town. And listen to this now. It finished too late for us to get changed before church. So we came as we are. You know, we say, don't we, come as you are? They thought we meant it. So they came as they were. So as he's telling me that, as he's talking to me, I'm talking to me about what he's saying to me. And I'm saying to me, hang on a minute, I've got people who drive a Mercedes who live up the road. If it's raining, won't come to church. Or if somebody looked at them odd last week, they're offended for 3 months and don't come back. I've got these guys who knew it would be a nightmare for them tonight. If they came dressed as women, they knew They get all of that and elbows flying. And I was aware of it, so they must have been. But they still would rather risk all of that, risk that rejection, than miss church, is what this guy just told me. So I'm thinking, shoot, which would I rather have? Which would God rather have? I said, that's amazing. I said, let me say 3 things to you. I said, first of all, you're the worst looking women I've ever seen. You are the worst looking women ever, because they were shockers. I mean, some transvestites do it so well, they look more like women than men. Brilliant. Good job. These guys, no. I mean, they hadn't shaved, hairy legs, terrible makeup. I'm like, dude, you are the worst looking women I've ever seen. If you want to do this right, I'll get some of our girls that work in makeup to coach you. I was serious. And this guy said to me, no, you don't understand. He said, I won. And showed me his medal. He said, I won. And his mate said, I was runner-up, and showed me his medal. I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you telling me you are the best transvestites in our city? God help us if we go intercity. You need to lift your game. The transvestite community need to lift your game. If you're the best in town, so these guys are laughing, I'm laughing, because I know they're not women. They know they're not women. And insult banter is what men do. You never see women teasing each other about being fat. Blokes do it all the time. We don't care. So I'm having man banter with them about how terrible they look. And they were laughing, weren't upset. They were laughing. They said, Pastor, what's the second thing you want to say to us? I said, the second thing is this. If you come to this church, you are welcome anytime. Dressed as men or women, I don't care. God doesn't care. I maybe just lost some religious people in here when I said that. God doesn't care. I said, but there's people here that will care, and I can't protect you from them. But on behalf of the management, you need to know you can come just as you are. We don't care. We're just glad and thrilled you chose to come tonight. He said to me, that's a strange thing to say to us. I said, I know. It tells you more about me, though, than it does about you. I said, because if I ask you not to come because your sin, as people would call it, your dual identity, your dysfunction, your weirdness, whatever people would call it, is obvious because it's in your clothing. But it is no more obvious to God than everybody else's hidden versions. So if I stop you coming because it's obvious in your clothing that you have a lifestyle we don't approve of, I would have to stop everybody coming. Because it's no different to everyone else's. It's just not obvious in everybody else's. So I said, I can't stop you for coming without stopping everybody from coming, because God doesn't look at the outward. We do, and we judge you by it, but God doesn't. They said, what's the third thing? I said, the third thing is if you come dressed as women, please, for my sake, don't use the women's toilets. As if you do, there'll be a freaking riot. I said, use the men's toilets, there'll still be a riot, but a bit less of a riot. They said to me, high five, we can do that. You know what happened? They came back many, many times since, never once dressed as women. That's interesting. Never asked them not to. I said, just come as you are. I don't care. You know what happened? What I think happened? I think they went home and said, or when they left the building that night, they said, let's not cause that man any more trouble. Let's not go and make it difficult for him. And I think maybe we going dressed as women makes his life more difficult than it probably should be. Let's not do that. They must have had a conversation like that. I didn't say don't. I said, come as you are. This is how God gets us to change. God gets people to give things up and volunteer change and surrender ground when we overwhelm them with grace and love and kindness and inclusion. I promise you, we want the word on the street about this church to be, you wouldn't believe who goes to that church. That's what we want to be said about this church. And what they mean is Zacchaeus goes there, and the thief on the cross goes there. All these people that no church would ever even look in their direction, their church is full of people like that, because that's what our church became. You wouldn't believe who goes to that church was the word on the street about our church. If I'd have died that day, and that's all they ever said about our church, I would have felt all the dramas I went through, all the stress, all the fights I had with people, all the sleepless nights, I would have felt it was all worth it for the word on the street to be, You won't believe who goes to that church, because that's their way of saying that we have discovered the heart of the gospel, which is not for only white, middle class, educated people with money and resources. It's for everybody, especially those that would never believe and never dream that God would look in their direction, and certainly never the church. This is your opportunity. This is your challenge. This is your privilege in this city in the years ahead. I've got to tell you, there are people out there tonight who would love to be here. Like some of you once wondered, would I be okay to go? There's thousands out there like that. It's our job to let them know in every way we can, you are accepted without us first asking you to change. The acceptance itself is enough to get people to begin to change. Let's stand together. Come on, time's gone.